All right, so now we're going to talk about how we measure population growth or the change in population levels and how population size is going to be regulated. One of the most important things that population ecologists need to understand is how population sizes change over time. There are two major types of population growth models seen in natural populations. And to understand those population models, first we need to understand some mathematical terms. And don't worry, we're not going to be doing the calculations in this class. We just need to understand the concepts. So first of all, this capital N is going to stand for the number of the total individuals in the population at the time, like at the first time period. Another thing that we need to know about is the rate of change that the population is experiencing. So that means how fast or slow or no growth is the population growing or shrinking. We're going to use this lowercase r to represent the rate of population change. If r is greater than 1, then the population is growing, and that means that the births plus the immigration is greater than the rate of deaths plus emigration. If r is exactly 1, then births and immigration is exactly the same as deaths and migration, and the population level is not changing at all. If we see that the r is less than 1, then the births plus the immigration is going to be lower than the death plus the emigration, so our population is going to be shrinking. When we look at the population growth of the California condors since 1980s, we can see that there's a clear growth in the population, so we can determine then that our R is at least greater than 1. We could calculate what it actually is, but we're not doing the calculations in this class. You're welcome. Our first population growth model, we'll look at the exponential population growth model. The size of the population in the future is simply determined by how big the population is now, our N, and we're going to multiply that by how fast the population is growing, which is our R value. So that means that the population size is going to increase with a 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, and so on pattern. Exponential growth is also called the J curve or the hockey stick curve if you've learned this stuff from a Canadian like I did. I guess that it looks like a hockey stick from the side. This type of population growth only occurs when resources are limited, but that really doesn't actually exist in nature. So we usually see this type of population growth for the short term, and either that population is going to crash, right? And we're going to go from a positive or a R value of greater than 1 to an R value of less than 1, or we're going to see that population level kind of growth kind of level out. The logistic growth curve is when there's limited resources in the environment, and that affects how big a population can grow. And if we look now at our mathematical equation down here, it's a little bit more complicated because we have to include this other variable called the carrying capacity. And we're going to use the mathematical symbol K in our equation for carrying capacity. As I was typing my script, I kept trying to spell carrying capacity with a K. Well, you get used to it. Carrying capacity is the maximum number of individuals that a given environment can support without causing environmental harm or causing that environment to become degraded. So now let's have a look at our equation. So this first part looks just like our exponential growth curve, where we are taking our how fast the population is changing. We're going to multiply it by what the population level is now. Right, that was all of our exponential, but now with our logistic growth, now we have to include this. Okay, so we're going to take our carrying capacity, and we are going to subtract it from what our population is, then take that, and then standardize it by our carrying capacity just by dividing it. So the second term is kind of the reality check. that's given to us based on our environment. If the actual current population is much smaller than our carrying capacity, then this term is going to be close to 1. So if we have a carrying capacity of 100 and we minus our population size is 1, then 99 divided by 100 is essentially 1, right? It's going to be really, really close. And so when we times anything, this rate times the population by 1, it's going to be about the same. Now, and that's going to mean that our population is going to be following, mostly going to look a lot like our exponential growth. And we can kind of see that here on this curve right here. Now, as our population level gets closer to that carrying capacity, what we're going to see is the rate of change is going to start slowing down. So our carrying capacity, that was 100, we have a population size of 99. We divide that by k. We're going to have that whole term is going to be close to 0. There's going to be little population growth. And so that is what we kind of see here. So this red dotted line represents the carrying capacity of these organisms for their given environment. And once we get the population level gets close to that, population growth kind of ceases, stables out at or just below the carrying capacity. And that change in the rate gives us what we call the S curve of our population change. And we see this in logistic growth. Now, carrying capacity is not a fixed number. In fact, carrying capacity, how many individuals an environment can support, is dependent on those environmental conditions. So for example, these seals at the time and the location when these data were collected, the carrying capacity was about 7,500 seals. But what if overfishing or pollution made it harder for the seals to find food? We saw a change in the environment. We're also going to see a change in the carrying capacity. We're going to see that carrying capacity lower. And then all the seals, right, there's going to be a significant amount of death, mortality rate, starvation, suffering, as we're reaching this new equilibrium at a new carrying. So I put these side-by-side comparisons of the two population growth models in here just for your ease of studying. So most species have adaptations that allow their lifestyle, their body size, reproduction strategies. They're going to allow them to fit into one of these two models. And so let's have a look at that. In K-selected species, right, that are really going to be using that logistic growth model, and that's represented by this blue line here in this graph. They tend to be adapted to stable environments and have stable population sizes that are close to the carrying capacity, right? And remembering that that carrying capacity can be adjusted. So remember that K is that mathematical term for a carrying capacity. That's where the K-selected comes from. These species tend to be large in body size and live a relatively long time. Typically, K-selected species are going to have few offspring and have infrequent reproduction events, and they're going to invest a lot of resources into rearing those offspring. Many large mammals, like elephants, are K-selected. We can see that they have long lives. They reach sexual maturity when they're about 20. Pregnancy for elephants is about 22 to 23 months. So there's a lot of, and then they raise those calves until they're about 17, well into teenagers. They have a very similar, actually reproductive cycle similar to humans. Our selected species, on the other hand, are adapted to unstable environments, and they have periods of where there's a ton of resources available in their environment, and then there's resources are removed, and then we kind of cycle through those boom and bust cycles. Their population size is also going to be unstable. We're going to have huge rates of growth, huge rates of die-off, huge rates of growth, huge rates of die-off. These species tend to be small, have frequent reproduction events, and or produce a lot of offspring all at once. And the trade-off is that those offspring are on their own, right? Low parental investment for our selected species. We tend to think of these as weeds or pests. And so our dandelions, as shown here, is an example of those. But the number one rule in biology is that there's always an exception to the rule. So sometimes organisms have characteristics that are K-selected and some characteristics that are similar to what we see in our selected species, and they kind of fit somewhere in between. So example of the sea turtle is that they have a large body size, they have long generation times, they lived a couple hundred years, some species, and they produce a lot of offspring at once. They provide, besides nesting, they provide little to no parental care. So once those eggs hatch, you're on your own, kid. So they have some characteristics of K-selected and some characteristics of R-selected. So our organisms don't always fit into our nice little categories that us humans like to shove things into. Now, carrying capacity is going to be determined by the interactions of abiotic factors, which are non-living factors in a given environment. So that can be like temperature, precipitation, natural disasters, things like that. And so our abiotic factors and our biotic factors, those are our living factors. And those can be things like competition, diseases, and other things. And the combination of those abiotic and biotic factors is going to determine how the carrying capacity, and so how many resources are available and how big can populations get. So then we can kind of categorize these into two major categories, which are density dependent factors that are going to affect how large a population can get. So and density dependent factors, these are going to affect how population is growing based on how packed in are those individuals. This means that the density of the population is going to affect those elements of demography, the birth rates, the growth, and mortality. So some density dependent factors that might affect these forces could be disease, right? If you're going to be all drinking from the same watering hole that maybe is contaminated with a pathogen, we can have that spread throughout the whole population. We can have competition where some individuals are getting more food than others. These horses might be more prone to predation because there's a whole bunch of them gathered in the same place. And so if you're a predator, you might be like, oh yeah, that's an easy way for me to get dinner. Okay, so there's lots of others, but typically our density dependent factors tend to be our biotic factors that affect how fast a population can grow. Our density independent factors then are factors that affect population dynamics that cause mortality without regard to how many individuals there are all at once. So if we think back to our California condor case study, the number one cause of death for California condors today is lead poisoning. And the amount of lead exposure that a California condor gets does not depend on how many condors there are in a given area. But mostly it's how about human activity is what causes California condor death. So if you hunt, don't use lead bullets. Keep our condors safe. Okay, so some examples of some density independent factors that do not depend on how many individuals there are in a population are extreme weather events, natural disasters, pollution like lead pollution, and they tend to be abiotic.